Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the Spinetinglers series. And today we're going to be looking at book number 20, Lights, Camera, Die. Now, just in case you are brand new to the Spinetinglers reviews, or maybe you might remember this series from your childhood if you're a 90s kid, I like to kind of run down some basic information before we go any further about thoughts, and then the plot overview, and then my overall review at near the end. So, if you don't know, this is a 30-book series published by, I think, Avon Camelot back in the 90s to kind of coincide with the cash grab hype that Goosebumps had created and Are You Afraid of the Dark had created for kids' horror anthology series. And this series is 30 books, and it's entirely ghost-written, credited under the name of MT Coffin. That's like a pun for empty coffin, get it? So that always cracks me up. But yeah, this 30-book series is completely ghost-written, and each book has different authors. So far in the series, I've touched on authors that are throughout this, like Joe Simon, or Jim Simon, I think, George Edward Stanley, Kathleen Dewey. I did a Jim DeFelice one. Those are all the ones off the top of my head. I probably have done another, maybe. But this one is the first one I'm doing of a writer named Mike Ford. Now, Mike Ford might be kind of familiar if you're a fan of the Frightville series. It's like a 4-book series that's from Scholastic. He recently did that. Then he made a book called The Lonely Ghost that came out recently. I think that's what the book's called. And that's more like a Mary Downing Hahn type of horror story. And then back in the day, he did work on the Erie, Indiana book series. So he has some background in some horror, and I kind of wanted to break the seal and try some things Mike Ford. He did like a few books in this series, and I chose this one because this one looked really fun. I was in the mood for a movie theater read, and I'm glad I picked this book up because this book is such a love letter to those old black and white horror movies from like the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and even homages some things from the 60s and 70s at the heart of it. If you're a fan of old horror, like Universal Monsters, or anything like that, like Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, this book might be for you. Now, it's not the scariest book by any means. It's just really atmospheric, and it, like I said, it pays a love letter to all those movies that inspired this book. You can clearly tell this movie mentions Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi in it. I mean, there's a lot of love Mike Ford put into this story for movie fans and horror movie fans, and I really resonate with it. And I really enjoyed it for what it is. It's not the greatest book ever, but in terms of this series, in terms of writing technicality and all of that, I put Mike Ford up there with Robert Hirschfeld with quality of writing. I mean, this book was written very well. It was paced very well. It's not as airtight as it could be, and I'll get to that near the end. But yeah, this was a solid one. I would highly recommend it, especially if you've never read any Spinetinglers before, or maybe you're just a horror movie fan. Try this out. You'll really enjoy this. Pick this up. It might do it for you. So, let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So, this book starts off with a prologue, and it's by an unnamed person. You don't know who this person is yet. And it kind of sets the mood for the story about how movies can sometimes mirror reality and how scary it can be. And it sets the groundwork for the first chapter where we get thrown into the story and we meet the protagonist named Ian. Now, Ian is revealed to be this big-time horror nut. He's like a 12-year-old kid. He's really into horror movies. He has a horror movie club with his 2 best friends, who I think are named Elizabeth and Billy. And Elizabeth and Billy and him are all outcasts, kind of, but they like their little exclusive club they've made. They call themselves the 3 Monsterteers because that's what they do. They get together, they read horror novels, movie novelizations, they watch horror movies, stuff like that. So they're really engrossed with the horror genre itself. And being somebody who grew up pretty much the same way as a horror hound, I can immediately plug myself into these characters. And some traits you see with these 3 characters is that they're more heroic than your average kids horror group, or even Ian is own protagonist, like the sole protagonist here, he is a very heroic type, and you'll get that sense in the first chapter and as the story goes along. He's very well versed in how horror movies work, and that'll come in handy for how the plot unfolds. So it's a stormy weekend heading, to where they live. I think they say they live in like New York or something. I want to say that it's probably wrong, but they live somewhere in the northeast of the United States. And it's a stormy weather coming through that weekend, and him and his friends, the Monsterteers, are walking down the street, and they see this theater they haven't noticed before on the way home. And it's all lit up. It's like this old school mom and pop theater. It has all these lights on, has these posters, it looks all dazzling. And they get greeted at the ticket stand by this guy named Mr. Faust. And they're talked to by Mr. Faust. And Mr. Faust said that he has opened this theater called the Oddity Theater. And the Oddity Theater is I guess a single Cineplex type of place. And he only will show horror movies there. And the kids are really excited about this. They're like, oh, this is really cool. And they're invited to come the next day, which is supposed to be the premiere night for this movie called The Ultimate Horror. And they've never heard of this movie, but they're excited to see horror movies. And since it's targeted to younger kids, they're really excited to see what can happen. So they get all excited. They branch off and head their own ways before the storm hits, and they all head home. So the next day comes around, and Ian's talking to his mom about going to this movie with Elizabeth and Billy. And he's talking about this theater, and the mom kind of brings up this point that she goes, well, I was by there the other day, and it was boarded up. Just yesterday, even, it was boarded up. And Ian kind of thinks back like, oh, something might be off about this, But he seems optimistic. He seems pretty genuine with his mom that, hey, look, no, the movie theater's open. We're going to definitely go see this movie. And the mom's like, okay, well, have fun. It's kind of cool that they managed to renovate it all within one day. So he meets up with Elizabeth and Billy at the theater at the right time that Mr. Faust told him to show up. And when they get there, it's about to storm, and they're immediately taken inside by Mr. Faust. And Mr. Faust says, welcome to the show. Make sure you grab some refreshments. Can I grab you something? And, he's like a one-man worker, and he grabs him some popcorn and some candy. And it's like an old school theater, so they have like candies in jars, and they have all this stuff like old school beverage fountains and a really old school popcorn maker. And they're like, oh yeah, we'll get some of that. But then they notice before they grab anything, they're like, oh wait, there's nobody else here. And Mr. Faust is like, oh, it's storming. Looks like you guys will be the only people coming tonight, so might as well give you a private tour. So before they go any further, they grab their snacks. Mr. Faust then takes them on a little private tour. He takes them to a part of the theater that nobody's usually allowed to go in. And they see all these pictures and posters of these classic horror movies and actors and actresses. And off the bat, they immediately see posters of and pictures of Boris Karloff, and they see pictures of Bela Lugosi and Lon Chaney. And they're like, oh, that's so cool. And Mr. Faust kind of says he has a history working in the movie business, goes back many, many years, and he had a dream of making his own movies, and that's essentially what he's done here. The Ultimate Horror is then revealed to be his movie, and they're getting pretty much a private show, and they're like, oh, this is so cool. And he's like, okay, so why don't you go to the auditorium and find your seats, and I'm going to get the projector ready. So he heads up to the projection room, and the kids make a mental note where the projection room is. So the kids head down to the auditorium where the movie will be playing, and the whole auditorium is also equally magnificent. There's silk-laden seats, ornate, beautiful carpets. The curtains for the screen look beautiful as well. And there's this intricate dome art there's a dome on the ceiling, and it looks like a starry night, and it looks very vivid and real. And these kids are taken back by all the details. And of course, they get excited when the curtain finally pulls, and they hear the projector rolling, and this movie called The Ultimate Horror kicks on. Now, The Ultimate Horror, they're looking at the names of the actors as it's popping up. Like, they kind of mention in the story how real the letters look and how like the res pop, like there's like blood looking colors that spill down the screen that look kind of brutal and cool. And then you see this name of an actress they remember seeing back in the hall. Now I didn't mention this because I don't want to ruin the suspension of it, but there's an actress named Marilyn Beauregard who Ian saw a picture of in the hallway of the private tour that Mr. Faust was giving him. And he claimed to see the picture of Marilyn Beauregard move around and kind of change her face from smiling to screaming. And she seems to be looking behind her, that something's coming after her. And something seems off about the picture. And when he sees the name, he's like, oh, that's Marilyn Beauregard. We saw her picture in the hallway. And Mr. Faust kind of drops some mild information that Marilyn Beauregard has starred in over 32 of his movies. And also, when they discovered Marilyn's picture, they saw a bunch of other kid actors' pictures, because Marilyn's also a kid actor. And they're like, oh, he has a lot of kid actors in his movies, so this might be interesting. So, they see the name Marilyn, and then the movie kicks on, and they finally see Marilyn as the lead character, and she supposedly is staying at this movie director's house, who has a bunch of cursed, I forget what they call them, film canisters, where they house the movies. They're all cursed, and she accidentally knocks them over and releases some of the monsters into the house. Now, unfortunately, 6 other kids are on the way to the house, and 3 have already arrived. And before the story can get any further, when these first 3 kids emerge out of the graveyard onto the spooky director's house, the power cuts out in the theater, and the 3 kids are looking around like, oh, when is this movie going to come back on? They're shouting for Mr. Faust. They don't know what's going on, and they look up, and the only thing they can see is the moonlight coming through, but this time it looks too real a little bit. And then the lights kick back on, and before they know it, they're staring around inside of this kind of creepy mausoleum place. And they're like, what is this place? And they look around, and they see some like angel pendants on the statues nearby, and they realize they're in a graveyard. And they put 2 and 2 together, and they essentially come to the conclusion that they're now inside of the movie The Ultimate Horror. And they can't figure out if they're dreaming or not, but they decide to go ahead and just try to figure out a way out of this trap that they're in. And they touch this angel thing, which kind of frees them. And they wander out into the graveyard, and they're trying to figure out a way. They come to the conclusion that they have to find a way out of this movie, because this is too creepy. And they head into this like sewer type of tunnel, and as they're walking, they hit a dead body. I'm not kidding. A skeleton corpse of like a 12-year-old boy, and there's writing on the wall saying, "Beware the Cree." Now, they're like, what does this mean? And before they know it, they have somebody come behind them and snatch Elizabeth. And then the next chapter picks up where they're all taken into this secret passageway and taken back to the director's house. And it was none other than Marilyn Beauregard, the actress, who saved them. And Marilyn kind of drops this huge bombshell on the kids, saying that she survived 32 of this guy, Mr. Faust's movies. And these movies are actually real when you're in the movies. And if you die, you legitimately die. And all the people in this movie are people that he's randomly chosen throughout, I guess, anywhere of the United States or the world, where he sets up these little fake theaters, and he uses magic or something to suck them into a movie. So when they hear this realization, and they're like, well, how do we get out of the movie? And Marilyn's like, well, I have the script, because I was given the script before I was put in the movie. And Marilyn kind of drops some bombshells later on that she's considered an extra. And there's this whole extra versus the star, which is the movie monster concept. But she kind of drops some information saying that she got the script ahead of time because she was put into the movie. So she can look at the script to see what's going to happen next. And the kids are like, no. We got to go save the other 3 kids that were brought into this movie too. Let's not forget about them. And Marilyn's like, okay, well, we can try to get out of this movie alive, but there's no guarantee to go back to reality, because normally if you survive the movie, you just get put into another movie. So Ian, Billy, and Elizabeth and Marilyn go up and try to get the other kids who are staying inside of this director's house. And they go up to this girl named Bet's room, and it's discovered that she's missing by this character called the Creeper. And we'll learn about them a little bit soon here. Then they go to this girl named Joan's room and get her, and then they rescue this boy named Greg. And Bet's missing, captured by this character called the Creeper. And Marilyn has another bombshell about the Creeper. The Creeper, he's considered a star of the film, and it's actually a former co-extra that she was in a couple of movies with, that ended up signing his soul over to the director slash Mr. Faust, that's the other name he has, is the director, to be a star in the film so he doesn't have to risk being killed in every movie. And how these movies work is that essentially when you become a star, every time somebody plays this movie, they'll be the star, but there will always be different extras fulfilling those needed roles, because most of the time they die or something. So, in the Ultimate Horror, it's kind of implied and inferred that this movie's been played a couple times because somebody's already died in the tunnel of this movie. So, somehow, some way, Marilyn was promoted to being the star character of this movie, like as not the star of the movie, but the lead character. And her former co-star was promoted to be the star of the movie, which is the Creeper, which I think is supposed to be this character on the cover. So Bet is thought to be captured by the Creeper, and they're wondering what to do next, and they look at the script, and it says, well, you have to go explore this room of the house. So they're like, okay, well, maybe if we follow the script, we can find a way out of the movie. And when they do that, they catch on to what the plot of this movie is. So essentially, the plot of the movie is exploring all these monsters that Marilyn's character had released beforehand. And what you have to do is find them in part of the house and then trap them in whatever movie has come to life from the canister that's residing in a certain area of the house. So when they enter this one room, they're taken to this vampire movie, essentially. And they're transported into the vampire movie. And it's very meta how this works. And it's very loose, but you got to follow me here. So they get put into this vampire movie, and now they have to figure out where this thing called the vault is. So the vault is where the film canister would be. And what they have to do is go find the film canister, and they come to a conclusion where they have to grab pieces of the monster, put it in the film canister, and then shut it back in the vault so they can move on to the next movie. So while this is going on, they're searching around, and Greg goes missing and gets captured by this vampire character. And there's a couple of creepy scenes dealing with vampires here, a couple close calls. But Greg actually gets turned into a vampire, and he's like becoming thirsty for blood. And the kids are trying to hold on to him and try to make it to the next movie and hope that he gets reverted back to normal. And they successfully pull it off. But after doing so, in the intermission between the vampire movie and to the next movie, Joan ends up running off, and nobody can seem to find where Joan went. So they go into the next part, the next movie, which is this camp werewolf story, and that's just pretty creepy. So they commonly talked about how the director likes to come in and insert twists, and even the director, after they solved how to defeat the vampire, which essentially put a bat into a canister, like a vampire bat, and shut it into the vault, the director said, well, keep going, you're doing a good job. And the kids are like, okay, this is weird, but I guess we have no choice but to listen. When they get to the werewolf movie, they see these kids surrounding a campfire, and they're like, okay, we have to save you. We're trying to save you. You guys are extras in these movies. You're going to be killed by the star of the movie. And the extras are like, nah, we don't believe in that and all that. And then it's revealed that all these kids around the vampire are actually the werewolves. And all, Marilyn, Billy, Elizabeth, Ian, and Greg, because Greg was turned back to normal, they all run back to the lodge nearby because it's a campground. And they're trying to hide out, and then they're looking for the vault, desperately looking for the vault where the film canister is, and they find this closet, and they find this closet, and they find the film canister of the movie that they're in, and they open it, and they realize they have to get some werewolf fur. So they grab this fishing pole and some tape. They go on the roof and get some werewolf fur onto the tape, and then they quickly try to get back in off the roof and put it in the canister and shut it into the vault. And they do that with literally by a smidgen of a hair. So when that movie's over, they're taken to another world, which this time they're in a world of sand. And they're like, okay, this must be an Egyptian movie with mummies and stuff. So essentially they have to find their way to this pyramid because Marilyn kind of remembers this movie. Apparently she was a former star in this one. So or a former extra in this one. So she leads the way to the pyramid, and they all enter this pyramid. And there's trap doors and booby traps and all of that they have to get through. And they eventually make it up this weird staircase into what is considered the vault. But unfortunately, the staircase is so tall, they have no way down realistically, because it took them forever to get up there. So they find the vault, and Marilyn gets this idea to touch this statue, which collapses everybody in the vault all the way down to this chamber, which houses this queen mummy character. And when they get in there, the mummy character comes alive. Now, the canisters all fell down into the room with them, so they have to scramble to find the right canister of the mummy movie. And while this mummy is attacking Ian bravely decides to take the mummy wraps and unwrap it. And as the mummy comes unwrapped, they slowly see who it is. And plot twist, it's Joan. And Joan grunts, and then the director tries to interfere and says, whoa, this is not in the script. They're starting to go way off script and really upset the director. And it's revealed that Joan, when she escaped in the intermission between the vampire movie and the werewolf movie, had sold her soul to Mr. Faust so she could be a star and can avoid being killed, essentially. So when that's revealed, the kids really don't know what to make of it, but they're like, we got to save Joan anyway. So the director decides to throw a little monkey wrench into the equation. But since they already had the vault down there with them, they had to put all the mummy bands into the canister and hope that it stays there. So they push this other button to ensure that happens, and then they're taken out of the mummy movie. Now, one of the final movies they get brought into, the fourth and final movie, is the Frankenstein's monster movie, which kind of goes into some commentary of reusing sets, because films tend to reuse sets. It's the same set of the vampire movie, so the vault's kind of in the same location. And they have some weird interactions with this kid, with this character. I want to say his name is like Frankenberries or something. Something weird like that. I forget off the top of my head. But this kooky scientist needs to harvest this kid's brains. And they're like, no, you can't have our brains. So they dart off and they split up. And they're trying to dodge the scientist and these monsters that he's created. And they look like, you know, patchwork men because they're, you know, scientific abominations. And they eventually come up with the conclusion when they meet this final climax with these Frankenstein monsters and this kooky scientist, that he's created this shrink ray and he wants to use it and use the kids as test subjects. And that's why he's, you know, coming after them. So somehow Ian gets the shrink ray and shrinks the Frankenstein monsters and the kooky scientist down and puts them in the film canister and stores them in the same location vault of the vampire movie because they reuse sets. Which then brings them back to the first movie they were in, and it's kind of revealed that the mission of the movie was accomplished, but there's one problem. There's still one character left, and that is the Creeper they have to defeat. Now, the Creeper early on took bet. Now all the remaining characters are like, okay, well, we kind of know where this one kid died. We have to go back down there. The vault for the canister must be near there because it says beware the Cree. So that must be beware the Creeper. And that must mean that where the vault would be is down in that tunnel system. So they head down to the tunnel and they see the dead body again and they keep going. And Ian bravely comes to a point where he's willing to sacrifice himself for everyone else. And he's like, I'm going to go into this pipe. I think the vault's down there. And he goes down the pipe, this really gross looking pipe, and he enters this room with like green gunk everywhere, and then he finds Bet. And Bet is like tied up, and she's like screaming at him to leave and turn around. And when he turns around, the creeper's there, and the creeper is now like, okay, well, now you're both are going to be my victim. And Ian tells Bet to run, and then of course Ian has some close calls with the creeper and escapes himself. So he finds where the vault is, and then he's like, okay, now we have to get the canister. So early on they had the canister, and they make it out of the vault. They lure the creeper out, and no, they had the canister. They had to get the canister from that room and then take it to the vault, which is inside the house, the meeting place where Marilyn brought them in to begin with. So he heads down the pipe system and goes to that secret passageway that Marilyn rescued them early on, and they lower the creeper into the vault, and they throw the canister in there with them. Now, reminder, the creeper character is a former co-star extra of Marilyn Beauregard, and they don't even bother to save him like they did Joan, which is kind of weird and frustrating. But essentially, the creeper gets defeated, and the director's all upset that the movie's ruined, but he has a twist to not make any of them escape. So while they're awaiting the results of the vault, the three main characters from the beginning of the story, Ian, Billy, and Elizabeth, are all taken out back to the theater. And let's just say there's a thing they have to go through in the theater, and there may or may not be a bunch of monsters there, like real life monsters, watching this movie called The Ultimate Horror. And they may not be onlooking all the other kids that they met in the movie, and they're all asking where the three kids went, and the kids are like, well, we have to do something about Mr. Faust. So they remember where the projection room is, and they may or may not put it into Mr. Faust's movie, and may or may not save the day. Now there's an epilogue at the end that kind of throws a plot twist in a monkey wrench. I don't want to spoil it because it's kind of good, and that's where I'll leave you. That's essentially Lights, Camera, Die. So, yeah, a lot to go over. A lot happens in this book, but there's also a lot of positives. The protagonists in this story are very focused characters. They're very heroic characters. They know their stuff about horror movies, and they all tend to bond with these other kids who have been taken into these horror movies. And it kind of is touching to see a bunch of strangers get together, like groups of strangers, and work together for a common goal. And it's a very different feeling movie. This book. This book is very imaginative about old horror movies. Has a really fun atmosphere, really fun plot. Mr. Faust / the director is a really interesting villain. And yeah, I mean, this story has a lot of twists and turns, a lot of vibes going for it, and it's just all around great for the most part. My only issues I have with this book, I don't really have much to say, but honestly, the whole thing about the creeper not being saved, because, you know, Joan was saved when she was the mummy character, but the former extra that Marilyn knew, them not getting saved as the creeper kind of bugs me, and it's kind of makes the whole Joan thing feel like a waste. And that's never even resolved as is. Joan, she sold her soul to Mr. Faust to be the star of that movie, but the kids still rescued her and took her out of the Mummy movie, and then apparently she's fine now. So does she still have her soul? What happened to her soul? We don't know, because the story never answers that question. So why they don't save the creeper character too? Because essentially the creeper character and all the monsters in this movie are kids too, that turn themselves into the stars of the movies? I don't know. Plot convenience. And then another slight negative I have is that, you know, this book does lean into some cliches, I'm being honest, and it does kind of get in the way of the scares at times. But that's more of a mild nitpick than anything, as the cliches here were done fun and creatively, and I can let a lot slide with it. But it was a slight negative to see cliches about vampires and mummies and all that. It kind of got old. And it was very formulaic. A lot of the plot got hung up in going from one movie to another and getting hung up in that, exploring each movie briefly. And it didn't really hit all the notes I was looking for in those exploration bits in those movies, but it was still atmospheric and still fun. So from a 0 to 5 star basis, I don't think this book is quite a 4.5 or higher territory, but I definitely think this is above a 4. And where I landed on this is just kind of in the middle of the road for a B. And I gave this book about a 4.3 out of 5. It has better writing than some other books in the series, but it does have some pretty glaring things that kind of get under my skin a little bit. It is kind of cliche, and it does feel a little bit played out and formulaic in areas where it shouldn't have been. But it was still well written, for the most part, airtight, and had some really great protagonists and some really great atmosphere, and a really fun premise to have. So yeah, highly recommend this one. Lights, Camera, Die. Let me know down in the comment section if you have read this before. Do you love this or do you hate this? I'm dying to know, and I'll see you next time.